Ansible overview. In this section, we're going to look at Ansible overview, including installation as well as the key concept of Ansible. So we're going to take a look at the Ansible overview. If you've been following the network automation progress in the last few years, you know Ansible is a framework that has been gaining a lot of momentum. So we're going to take an overview of what Ansible is and what it does and why is it so popular. And we're going to get the first playbook up and running, as well as a few more practical examples of Ansible playbooks for our Cisco devices. So first of all, what is Ansible? Ansible is a Python-based automation framework, not only for network devices, but started out with servers, gradually expanded out into all forms of automation, such as cloud modules, and for all the cloud providers like AWS, Azure, and of course, what we're interested in, networking. Currently, it's at version 2.5, and because this course is kind of a mixture of Python and then moving on to Python frameworks, that we don't have necessarily a lot of time to cover the basic ground. So we're going to stick with the latest and greatest version 2.5. Ansible has gone through several iterations for network automation, and the 2.5 is a major change from say 2.2 to 2.0. So I would encourage you to read a lot of if you use Ansible before, I would encourage you to at least glance through some of the resources that we're going to cover later in this video about the updates in 2.5. But just keep in mind that all the examples as given in the section and the next one will be at the latest 2.5, which has quite a bit of syntax change, as well as the method underneath, the network connection methods, the network OS version, and so on. So just keep in mind, this is at 2.5. It's agentless. From day one, it's agentless with SSH or API. This speaks very well to networking devices because most of the vendors, they don't want to put agents on their box. And a lot of other frameworks by default actually requires an agent on the device. Just imagine, if you go to Cisco and say, hey, please compile this agent to be on your iOS box or your NXOS box. And, I think there's quite a few pushbacks from them and say, this is not our software. Why do we want to do this? However, if you're doing agentless, that means the device itself, such as your networking device, doesn't need to have an agent, and they could just support SSH like they always have. Or, as you see from the newer boxes that they support API. So they could just, stick with what they have, what they already provided, and Ansible could just automate that way. And it's idempotent, meaning that if it doesn't make change, the ideology is that it doesn't make change unless it has to. So, say you're putting a new access list on the interface, and it does not try to put, if you execute the same playbook to put that access list on twice, it would make the change the first time, but you wouldn't make change the second time because you would have just grabbed that fact from the device and say, oh, it's already there, so I do not need to make it again. So it's important because first of all, it reduces the overhead, and second, it reduces the chance of making a mistake. If you just blindly push out the configuration out, there might be a greater chance of making a mistake. And the file formats are typically YAML and INI. Uses Jinja 2 for templates. As you will see, INI is pretty straightforward, but we'll spend a little bit of time looking at YAML. If you haven't worked with YAML before, it's a very simple language to work with. But if you haven't worked with before, there's a few things that want to be pointed out first before we dive fully into it. And it's generally a push model. It supports a pull model. It supports a pull model from the Ansible's perspective and pull information from the device. However, it's generally a push model where it means when you execute the playbook, that it pushes out the configuration. And the general overall architecture is that you have a playbook that is in the YAML format, and each playbook could consist of one or more plays, and each play could consist of one or more tasks. And we'll see a lot more examples in this video and in this section and next section. It's open source, and it has the official support for the core modules, what they define for the core module. You should probably look up on the documentation. And it also has a support for third-party modules. You could contribute it back upstream. And there's also a commercial offering called the Ansible Tower. So if you want to have, like, to say the GUI interface or scheduling or logging, you could use the Ansible Tower with the commercial support. So Ansible is part of Red Hat. So if you think of the difference between Red Hat Enterprise Linux versus Fedora, that is kind of the motto of keeping a balance between open source and commercial offerings. And there's just so much more on Ansible. I personally have done a full course on Ansible before, as well as the books that I've written on Ansible. So there's no way that we could cover everything that Ansible is about in just 2 short sections. So we have, in this 2 sections, we have to strip down all what I would consider just the necessary portions, and also, just kind of speak through some of the points. But it's important enough that we touch base on Ansible as far as network automation, because that's just one of the major framework that's on the horizon and everybody's supporting it. So I would encourage you to take a look at some of the information that we're going to cover in just a bit, as well as the installation that we're going to prepare you for this section and next. I will see you in a bit and talk about the extra information, that important ones for network automation. Installing Ansible is pretty straightforward. So basically, we're using a Ubuntu box. So we went to the Ubuntu section of the installation document. We're going to update the repository repo, basically, and we're going to install the software properties common. And we're going to update the repository with the Ansible repository in order to read from that particular repository. Just make a note that you want to enter, and they'll ask you to reconfirm it. We're going to update the repository again, and the last step would just be to install Ansible. It's going to take you a little bit longer to install, but because I already have it, and that's why it's fairly fast. And once you've installed it, you want to make sure you have Ansible. So you have Ansible, and then let's look at the version, and let's also look at Ansible Playbook version to make sure you have the latest 2.5. So one thing that you could also see is that Ansible has a config file for wherever it's reading the config, and it will go ahead and detect your Python module location. For us is 2.7, and so this is where it's going to use as far as Ansible. So Ansible actually uses Python underneath for both executing the locally commands and as well as for servers. At least you will go ahead and SSH to the remote box and pushed over a Python module, execute a Python module, and so on and so forth. But for our purpose, for network automation, it's execute locally and uses Paramiko locally to SSH to the device, or use the API version, some other Python modules to do that. So that is a quick overview of the installation. So now we have Ansible installed, so we could start executing different playbooks and move on from here.